Today is December 1st, 2024. As the conflict in Ukraine continues to escalate, as the situation for Ukrainian forces and their Western backers deteriorate on the battlefield, the U.S. is expanding the conflict not just in and around Ukraine, but elsewhere along Russia's periphery. This is something that I have talked about for years, and this is something that we can see now clearly playing out. Most recently, there is an offensive by factions of Al-Qaeda backed and armed by the United States. I will provide evidence for all of that here in just a moment. These forces, obviously preparing for months ahead of time, have now launched a very large offensive. They are sweeping down from the north into the very large city of Aleppo and other areas along the line of contact there. As a matter of fact, let's just look at the map. So this is also liveuamap.com, which I regularly refer to in regards to the conflict in Ukraine, as a pro-Western map. You have to keep that in mind. Every single conflict depicted in these maps will represent Western bias. This is Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel. Everything in red is controlled by the Syrian government. These areas here are militants, extremists, and they are surrounding a U.S. base that is actually located there on the border. These dark gray blotches, this is ISIS territory. And in yellow, this is the U.S. military occupation and their Kurdish proxies. They are occupying eastern Syria, and they have for years now. And this latest offensive is emanating out of the Turkish-held buffer zone in northern Syria. So when Russian-backed Syrian forces were retaking all of Syria, the U.S. and Turkey intervened, sent in forces, occupying what was left of militant-held territory to keep the conflict from actually fully ending, to freeze it, essentially. And this is what I have warned the U.S. since the special military operation began in February 2022. I've warned that the U.S. will most likely resort to a very similar strategy in Ukraine. So it's very important to pay attention to how this has played out, to get a glimpse into how it will play out in Ukraine. So these were Turkish, NATO, US-backed, CIA-backed, armed, trained, equipped terrorists, all in this area around Idlib. They are now pushing downward, east and south. This was Aleppo city. Let's just look at the timeline feature. As of November 1st, this is where the line of contact was. And now let's go back to the most recent data. You can see how far they have pushed. This is significant. Aleppo is the second largest city in Syria. This is significant. And even though the green is where this map is confirming militants have seized territory, you can see these icons indicate that they are operating all across the actual city of Aleppo. Now, I've seen a lot of people panicking online in regards to this. You have to remember that before Russia intervened in 2015, almost the entire country was overrun by US-backed terrorists. Almost the entire country, including parts of Damascus. The Syrian government was fighting over parts of Damascus for control between themselves and US-backed terrorists. So it had been many, many times worse. There are a lot of questions as to how this could possibly have happened. Did Syrian, Russian, Iranian intelligence not detect this? Or did they detect this and determine there was really nothing they could do about it? Russia, Syria, Iran are all overstretched by years and years and years of US proxy war, and even in some cases direct war. Are they unable to stop this at all? Are they simply accepting that there was no way to stop this initial push, but are fairly confident they can at least stop it and then begin retaking territory? These are all questions that only time can tell. There's no way to tell now. Only Russia and Syria know the true disposition of their forces and their capabilities versus whatever it is they see themselves facing on the battlefield. That information will avail itself publicly in time, but we have to wait for that time to pass. I'm not going to tell people one way or the other unless I actually have information that I can base it off of. Now, let's look at what the Western media is saying. This is the BBC. Syrian rebels take control of half of Aleppo, observers say. Now, I want to make it clear. These observers are based in the UK. This is a Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. And this was a propaganda outfit that the UK and the rest of the Western media referenced throughout the entirety of the US proxy war on Syria since it began in 2011. So keep that in mind. Rebel forces in Syria have taken control of half of the country's second largest city, Aleppo, according to the UK-based monitoring group, Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. The offensive is the largest against the Syrian government in years, and the first time rebels fighting the forces of President Bashar al-Assad have reached Aleppo since they were forced out of by the army in 2016. So Aleppo had been under control of US-backed terrorists until the government regained control in 2016. So keep that in mind. Things had been much, much worse than what is taking place right now, as bad as it is, and it is bad. Aleppo's airport and all main roads leading into the city have been closed, military sources told Reuters news agency. The rebels were able to capture half of Aleppo without meeting significant resistance. That is important to understand. That means the military knew this was coming, and they decided rather than try to stop it outright, they would fight a fighting retreat, and they will reposition someplace where they can regroup and determine what to do and how to do it. Let's continue. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights Director Rami Abdel Rahman told AFP News Agency earlier on Saturday there has been no fighting, not a single shot was fired as regime forces withdrew, he added. Earlier on Friday, government forces said they had regained positions in a number of towns in Aleppo and Idlib provinces, following the offensive launched by HTS and allied factions on Wednesday. Video posted on a channel affiliated with the Islamist group. When they say Islamist, and all of these different factions, whatever name they're assigning to them, they are the various flavors of Al-Qaeda created by the US and its Persian Gulf and Turkish allies in the region. It appears to show rebel fighters in vehicles inside the city. So Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is simply a synonym for Al-Qaeda, as is Jabhat al-Nusra, and the many, many, many different rebrandings of these terrorist groups the Western media has gone through over the many years. And they are doing the exact same thing in Syria that they are doing in Ukraine with Nazi military units inside the official Ukrainian armed forces, pretending that they aren't Nazis. These Nazi military units rebranding themselves, changing their literal Nazi logos to look a little more ambiguous, renaming them from, say, Azov to 3rd Assault Brigade, things like this, constantly rebranding, recreating their image as the public catches on to the fact that the US is supporting literal Nazis in Ukraine and literal Al-Qaeda, ISIS terrorists in Syria and elsewhere. Now, the BBC article gives their version of the background story of this conflict. More than 500,000 people have been killed in the civil war. It was never a civil war. It was always a US proxy war against Syria that erupted after the government cracked down on pro-democracy protests in 2011. No such pro-democracy protests took place. It was admittedly US planned, prepared, equipped, funded mobs put out into the streets In conjunction with militant groups, the US also began preparing years ahead of time. I'm going to go over all of the evidence for that in just a moment. Again, taken from the Western media itself. An array of armed groups opposed to the Assad government, including jihadists. They're all Al-Qaeda, ISIS, all terrorists, literal terrorists. Terrorists listed by the US State Department as terrorists on their lists. Took advantage of the turmoil to seize swaths of territory. No, the US deliberately created the turmoil to serve as a pretext for the armed overthrow of the Syrian government. The Syrian government, with the help from Russia and other allies, later retook most of the areas it had lost. Idlib, the last remaining opposition stronghold, is mostly controlled by HTS, but Turkish-backed rebel factions and Turkish forces are also based there. Now let's go back to the map. And you tell me where support for armed groups could possibly be coming from in this area, if not from NATO territory in Turkey. That is Turkey, and this is where they are. So unless these terrorist organizations are picking Kalashnikovs off date trees in Syria, their arms and ammunition are coming from Turkey via the US, CIA, special forces, gathered up from around the globe with money and contributions from other US allies, both in Europe and in the Persian Gulf, and of course in Turkey itself. That is how this proxy war was prepared years before it began in 2011, and that is how it has been carried out ever since. And so why not just get into all of the evidence of that? How far back did US preparations for the so-called Arab Spring in 2011, how early did that begin, and which components did the US prepare ahead of time? It's important to understand this, to understand what is happening in Syria right now. So the first article that I will go over is this from the New Yorker. In 2007, we're talking about the Bush administration. This article, The Redirection, by legendary journalist Seymour Hersh. The link to all of this will be in the video description below. I will read a little bit of it for you. In the past few months, again, this is back in 2007, as the situation in Iraq has deteriorated, the Bush administration, in both its public diplomacy and its covert operations, has significantly shifted its Middle East strategy. The redirection, as some insiders in the White House have called the new strategy, has brought the United States closer to an open confrontation with Iran, and in parts of the region propelled into a widening sectarian conflict between Shia and Sunni Muslims. Now, ordinarily, Sunni and Shia Muslims can coexist. They do in Syria. The Syrian Arab Army falls under a president who is a Shia Alawite sect Muslim, but most of the Syrian Arab Army are Sunni Muslims, and they have fought shoulder to shoulder against US-backed extremists for years and years now. Continuing, this is still Seymour Hersh's 2007 article. To undermine Iran, which is predominantly Shia, the Bush administration has decided, in effect, to reconfigure its priorities in the Middle East. In Lebanon, the administration has cooperated with Saudi Arabia's government, which is Sunni, in clandestine operations that are intended to weaken Hezbollah, the Shia organization that is backed by Iran. The U.S. has also taken part in clandestine operations aimed at Iran and its ally Syria. A byproduct of these activities has been the bolstering of Sunni extremist groups that espouse a militant version of Islam and are hostile to America and sympathetic to Al-Qaeda. And in fact, the Muslim Brotherhood is the foundation upon which Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and all of these other extremist groups sprouted from. And it should be pointed out that Hamas is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, and at one point, Hamas was literally fighting alongside the US CIA armed and backed terrorists fighting in Syria. They were fighting side by side with them against the Syrian Arab Army, Iran, Hezbollah, and forces of the Russian Federation. Seymour Hersh cites a number of sources. One of these sources told him the Saudis have considerable financial means and have deep relations with the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafis. Again, because we remember that it was the US and its Persian Gulf allies arming and backing Al-Qaeda and ISIS for years and years and years. And it began with backing them actually in Syria, and then many of them being driven out, taking refuge in Afghanistan, where the US used them against the Soviet Union in the 1980s. The Saudis have considerable financial means and have deep relations with the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafis, who are Sunni extremists who view Shia as apostates. The last time Iran was a threat, the Saudis were able to mobilize the worst kind of Islamic radicals. Once you get them out of the box, you can't put them back. Another source, Seymour Hersh cited, it was explaining to him something that he had advised then U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney. And it says, if the United States does try to move against Syria, members of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood would be the ones to talk to. And that is exactly who the U.S., even at this time when Seymour Hersh was writing this article, the U.S. was backing in Syria. And they had been backing them since the 1980s, as a matter of fact, to overthrow President Bashar al-Assad's father before him. So the same source was cited again. The Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, a branch of a radical Sunni movement founded in Egypt in 1928, engaged in more than a decade of violent opposition to the regime of Hafez Assad, Bashar al-Assad's father. In 1982, the Brotherhood took control of the city of Hama. Assad bombarded the city for a week, killing between 6,000 and 20,000 people. Membership in the Brotherhood is punishable by death in Syria. The Brotherhood is also an avowed enemy of the US and of Israel. Nonetheless, the source said, we told Cheney that the basic link between Iran and Lebanon is Syria, and to weaken Iran, you need to open the door to effective Syrian opposition. And I want to point this out. Yes, the Muslim Brotherhood, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, if you ask the rank and file who their enemy is, they would tell you, yes, Shia Muslims, of course, and anyone else who is not an extremist like them, of course, and they would single out the US and Israel in particular as enemies. But in reality, the Muslim Brotherhood, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and all of these other extremist organizations under this umbrella are extensions of US foreign policy and that of its proxies, including Israel. And the problem is many ordinary people who do not have the time, the energy, or even the desire to inform themselves, who blindly hate Israel, not as if there isn't a good reason to oppose Israeli policies or the Israeli government in general, they will see these organizations overtly opposed to Israel and they will support them, unaware of the fact that these organizations are actually serving US and thus Israeli objectives in the region, not actually opposing them. And they used this to great effect in the opening days and weeks of the Arab Spring, because all of these organizations were well known around the world as being anti-US and anti-Israeli. Superficially, many people reflexively supported them without looking into the background of who many of these specific groups or leaders were connected to or being funded by. If you did that, you would have seen that it was from top to bottom, left to right, it was a US created opposition movement, had nothing to do with opposing US or Israeli interests. It was advancing them, and it was all doing it under the guise of opposing it. And I will get into that in just a moment. But Seymour Hersh's 2007 piece continues. There is evidence that the administration's redirection strategy has already benefited the Brotherhood. So at this time, the US not only knew the Muslim Brotherhood was the proxy of choice to use in undermining Syria and thus Iran, they were already well underway in supporting them. The Syrian National Salvation Front is a coalition of opposition groups whose principal members are a faction led by Abdul Halim Kadam, a former Syrian vice president who defected in 2005, and the Brotherhood. A former high-ranking CIA officer told me the Americans have provided both political and financial support. The Saudis are taking the lead with financial support, but there is American involvement. He said that Kadam, who now lives in Paris, was getting money from Saudi Arabia with the knowledge of the White House. In 2005, a delegation of the front's members met with officials from the National Security Council, according to press reports. A former White House official told me that the Saudis had provided members of the front with travel documents. So they were creating what would become a government in exile. And if you were familiar with the 2011 Arab Spring, that was the pattern. The US would start with these protests. They would move in the militant groups that they had been preparing and arming for years. They already had these governments in exile on standby in Europe, in Washington, in Virginia, ready to declare themselves the legitimate government of these targeted countries. And the US would then shift their recognition from the internationally recognized governments of these countries to these hand-picked client regimes that they had created ahead of time and had on standby. That was the pattern. Then if they were successful in overthrowing the targeted nation, they would install them into power, as they did in Libya, for example. Also, as they did in Egypt. As a matter of fact, the Muslim Brotherhood was also involved in the protests in Egypt in 2011, the Arab Spring protests in Egypt. There were US-backed National Endowment for Democracy funded political groups that created chaos in the streets. The Muslim Brotherhood came in to exploit it and escalate it with significant and armed violence. They eventually succeeded in overthrowing the Egyptian government, and it was the Muslim Brotherhood's Mohamed Morsi who actually ended up as president of Egypt until he was overthrown by the Egyptian military. Before he was overthrown by the Egyptian military, one of the very first things he did was cut all ties with the Syrian government, no longer recognizing the Syrian government as the legitimate government of Syria, and openly began supporting the US-backed terrorists trying to overthrow the Syrian government. When the Egyptian military overthrew the government of Mohamed Morsi and threw him in jail, one of the first things they did was reestablish ties to Syria and begin shifting support back to the government away from these armed terrorists, who were also the same terrorists and organizations the US used to overthrow the Egyptian government. So as you could see, it was a regional effort using the same networks that the US stood up in each and every one of these countries. And again, many people supported Mohamed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt because of their overt, superficial hatred of Israel, when in reality they were an extension of US foreign policy objectives. They were not opposing them, and if you're not opposing US foreign policy objectives, there's no way you're opposing America's Israeli proxies and their objectives. So that was Seymour Hersh all the way back in 2007, warning the world that the United States government at that time was working with the Muslim Brotherhood and other extremists to undermine and possibly even overthrow at least the Syrian government, but also Lebanon and possibly eventually Iran. Fast forward to 2011, the Arab Spring has sprung. These protesters are in the streets, these militants that the US was admittedly backing as far back as 2000, at least as far back as 2007. They are now taking advantage of this and attempting to violently overthrow all of these targeted governments, including the Syrian government. Again, because a lot of these groups were superficially anti-Israeli, people reflexively supported them, and they ignored all of the very obvious evidence that they were in fact backed by the US. They were not opposing the US. And eventually articles like this came out. This was by the New York Times. This was in April 2011. US groups helped nurture Arab uprising. This was not something that happened and the US took advantage of. This was something they created from whole cloth years in advance. A number of the groups and individuals directly involved in the revolts and reforms sweeping the region received training and financing from groups like the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, and Freedom House, a nonprofit human rights organization based in Washington, according to interviews in recent weeks and American diplomatic cables obtained by WikiLeaks. We have WikiLeaks to thank for a lot of this. Julian Assange's organization. The Republican and Democratic institutes that they just listed are affiliated with the Republican and Democratic parties in the United States, obviously. They are created by Congress and are financed through the National Endowment for Democracy, which was set up in the 1980s to channel grants for promoting democracy in developing nations. The National Endowment for Democracy, in turn, receives about $100 million annually from Congress. Freedom House also gets the bulk of its money from the American government, mainly from the State Department. So it is the US government funding political interference around the world and claiming that it is promoting democracy. It also admits in this New York Times article that some Egyptian youth leaders and many other opposition groups the US was creating and backing, attended a 2008 technology meeting in New York where they were taught how to use social networking and mobile technologies to promote democracy, in other words, to overthrow their respective countries. Among those sponsoring the meeting were Facebook, Google, MTV, Columbia Law School, and the State Department. And it wasn't just in 2008. They had these meetings every single year for a number of years. They still have these meetings, just under different groups. Right now, it's primarily the Oslo Freedom Forum. All of it is ultimately funded, organized, directed by the US State Department, either directly and openly or through intermediaries. I have provided evidence of this for years now. So the Arab Spring didn't start in 2011. It began years in advance. The US created the political organizations that would lead the protests on the street. They also created the militant organizations that would use the protests as cover to violently overthrow these different targeted governments, including Egypt, including Syria, also Libya, remember at the time. And Libya represented the full cycle. Political protests, militants trying to overthrow the country, US military intervention, and then the full overthrow and replacement of the government by a client regime. That was what was supposed to happen in each and every country. If it was possible, say, in Egypt to overthrow the government without military intervention, then so be it. In Syria, we can see that even with US military intervention, regime change failed. So it was a regional effort, and there was a mix of success and failure in each country that was targeted. So the BBC article this week talking about the terrorist offensive aimed at Aleppo and elsewhere across northern Syria, they're claiming this all started with pro-democracy protests the Syrian government was repressing. I just showed you evidence from the same Western media that the US prepared this years in advance. This had nothing to do with democracy. This was overthrowing governments the US didn't want in power so that they could tighten their grip of control over the entire Middle East. What does this have to do with Ukraine? How does this tie into Ukraine? Remember this 2019 Rand Corporation paper, Extending Russia, Competing from Advantageous Ground. Look at the table of contents. Under geopolitical measures, one was provide lethal aid to Ukraine. That happened during the Trump administration. That began and continued under the Trump administration and then the Biden administration. Measure number two, increase support to the Syrian rebels. Increase support, which means they were already supporting the rebels. How do we know that? Because the Western media admitted it. This was 2012. New York Times, CIA said to aid in steering arms to Syrian opposition. They were bringing it in by the plane load into Turkey and then moving it to the terrorist groups along the border and then into Syria. If you look at the map, the conflict map over time in Syria, you can see that these supposed pro-democracy rebels actually look like they simply invaded Syria from the border regions. They didn't uprise across the country. They came in over the borders, armed, trained, backed by the US and its regional partners. So this New York Times article says, A small number of CIA officers are operating secretly in southern Turkey, helping allies decide which Syrian opposition fighters across the border will receive arms to fight the Syrian government, according to American officials and Arab intelligence officers. The weapons include automatic rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, ammunition, and some anti-tank weapons, are being funneled mostly across the Turkish border by way of shadowy network of intermediaries, including Syria's Muslim Brotherhood, and paid for by Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, the officials said. So Seymour Hersh back in 2007 warned that this was happening. The New York Times is admitting by 2012, not only that it is happening, but they're explaining to you in part how it is happening. The CIA officers had been in southern Turkey for several weeks, in part to help keep weapons out of the hands of fighters allied with al-Qaeda or other terrorist groups, one senior American official said. Of course, they have to say that. They can't admit that there are no moderate rebels. They are all terrorists, and the U.S. not only is arming them, but doing it deliberately, and that was always part of the plan. Remember Seymour Hersh in 2007 talking about the Muslim Brotherhood and the fact that it was an extremist organization, that organizations like al-Qaeda are simply sprung out of the Muslim Brotherhood. But maybe you don't find that convincing enough. So I'm going to show you a US Defense Intelligence Agency document from 2012. This is it here. Again, the link will be in the video description below. This was published on judicialwatch.org. And we're going to read through several parts. First part here, the general situation. The Salafist, the Muslim Brotherhood, and al-Qaeda are the major forces driving the insurgency in Syria. The West, Gulf countries, and Turkey support the opposition. Who do they support? Salafist, Muslim Brotherhood, and al-Qaeda. They're saying it in black and white here in this US Defense Intelligence Agency document. While Russia, China, and Iran support the regime. In other words, Russia, China, Iran support Syria against internationally recognized terrorists. The US and its allies are backing in a proxy war against Syria. That is what this document is saying. It also says down here, if the situation unravels, there is the possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality in eastern Syria. And this is exactly what the supporting powers, who are the supporting powers? The US and its regional allies, as they said earlier in this document. And that is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition want. So the US wanted a declared or undeclared Salafist principality in order to isolate the Syrian regime, which is considered the strategic depth of the Shia expansion, Iraq and Iran. Salafist principality. Salafist, Islamic, principality, state. Salafist principality, Islamic state. The US deliberately created the Islamic State to do what? To isolate the Syrian regime. It is in black and white. That was the plan, and they admitted it in this leaked document. It is irrefutable, and that is what continues to this day. The US is using literal terrorists in the Middle East to overthrow governments it doesn't like, governments that it claims are the bad guys, while the US itself is backing, arming, facilitating the actual worst people in the region, possibly on the planet, besides themselves, of course. So getting all the way back to this recent BBC article, they talk about Russia's response. Russia's military said it had bombed extremist forces, has it in quotation marks. So all of the evidence that I just showed you, you can see how the BBC is still playing this propaganda game where it's pretending that these are pro-democracy rebels, not the worst sort of terrorists in the region that the US and its allies are backing. So it says Russia's military said it had bombed extremist forces, according to Russian news agencies, and there's a lot of footage of that taking place. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov expressed his support for the government of Syria to quickly restore order and said the country's sovereignty was under attack. Of course, obviously it is. These are terrorists backed by the United States with the help of Turkey. Again, remember the map of the conflict unfolding over several years. You can see the terrorists flowing into the country over the border. It couldn't be more obvious. Now, unless something has changed significantly since this conflict was essentially frozen around 2019, 2020, 2021, Russia and Syria still hold a major advantage over these militants. They have all sorts of weapons. They have large amounts of ground forces. They do not have air power. They do not have sophisticated air defenses. They have man-portable air defense systems with a limited range. They can target and take out low-flying warplanes or helicopters, but they are unable to reach warplanes flying at high altitudes, which are capable of dropping precision-guided weapons. This is how Russia assisted Syria in taking back their entire country. You saw how dire it was before the intervention, and you saw how much territory Syria then managed to take back. That was because these rat lines flowing from NATO into Syria were cut, and the fighters were isolated, and they were not able to sufficiently sustain their combat capacity on the battlefield. They were then moved on by the Syrian Arab Army and its allies on the ground, and they systematically wiped them out of the country, pushed them back into Idlib, where they have stayed until now. Russia's use of air power right now, it does not seem as if it's being contested. That would be a significant escalation. It would require US or Turkish intervention to target Russian warplanes flying at high altitude. It appears that they are able to hit the supply lines of these advancing terrorists, and that is going to inhibit their combat power. There is extensive footage of these terrorists being targeted by both Russian and Syrian military aviation. There is also footage of these terrorists surprising and overwhelming Syrian and Russian troops in small numbers. But I would warn people against trying to draw conclusions from open source evidence at this early stage. We simply do not know what is actually happening. We should not draw conclusions based on tactical vignettes available online. Now, the collective West is clearly overstretched. They are incapable of defeating Russia in any one of these targeted areas. They cannot outfight Russia in its proxy war against them in Ukraine. They have fundamentally failed until now to fight and overwhelm Russia and its allies in Syria. Even in Georgia, the US is having a hard time trying to reassert control over the government there. They are incapable of doing this for a number of reasons. First and foremost, as I have said over and over again, their military industrial capacity, their actual military power, the ability to fight Russia directly or even indirectly is greatly diminished. And even the sense of deterrence that the US could project with military power it has but is not using, even that is not producing the results that they desire vis-a-vis Russia in all of these areas. So what they're doing is using other means that they have invested in, including these armies of terrorists that they have been keeping around in northern Syria. And so it really is a matter of whether or not Russia can weather the summation of all of this pressure. What will Turkey do? And the whole reason Idlib was never retaken by Syrian forces backed by Russia and Iran was because Turkish forces moved into the area and created a buffer zone first. If Turkish forces move behind these advancing terrorists and claim this territory, Russia and Syria are going to have to make a decision. Do they go to war with Turkey directly to take this territory back, or do they just forfeit this territory? And if Turkey were to do this, this would cripple their credibility internationally. It was already questionable whether or not to deal in good faith with Turkey. Because of their status as a NATO member and their track record in the past, this would probably be the final deciding factor as to whether the multipolar world could trust and work with Turkey. Now, finally, again, we can kind of see very easily how this is all connected. All of this is an attempt by the US to encircle and contain Russia, Iran, China. If you look at a map, you can see how Russia, China, Iran, these are the core pillars of not only Eurasia, but the pillars holding up multipolarism. If you were to take out Russia, Iran, and China, there would be no multipolarism. It would revert back to US-led primacy over the entire globe. Russia is advancing, is committed militarily to Ukraine, and it is advancing rapidly in Ukraine. So the US has created a military dilemma for Russia in Syria, and it will have to make a decision about how to allocate resources. Does it have enough resources to invest in the defense of both its ongoing special military operation in Ukraine and its defense of Syria? But one thing I do think this tells us, the reigniting of armed conflict in northern Syria, despite all kinds of deals being made between Russia, Syria, and Turkey, is that any freeze in a conflict is going to be used by the US and its proxies as a means of rearming, reorganizing, and restarting the fight when the terms are more favorable for them. So this is exactly what they have just done in Syria. They spent years regrouping, rearming, and preparing for this offensive. This particular offensive was likely specifically planned for months ahead of time before it was just launched this past week. That is exactly what they're going to do in Ukraine. And as a matter of fact, we see them doing that in Ukraine. First of all, just to drive home this point, this is from Reuters, this November 26, 2024. So over the past week, Russia advances in Ukraine at fastest monthly pace since start of the war, analysts say. And what they're admitting is that despite authorizing the use of NATO missiles inside Russia, Russian forces are accelerating faster now than ever. In every respect, Ukrainian combat power is collapsing. And then we have discussions like this. And all of this points to the creation of a buffer zone in Ukraine, just as one was created in Syria. So this is Le Monde, French newspaper, discussions over sending European troops to Ukraine reignited. And this is the UK and France, but of course the UK and France would not even be discussing this if it wasn't the US planning this ultimately. And it says, as the conflict in Ukraine enters a new phase of escalation, discussions over sending Western troops and private defense companies to Ukraine have been revived, Le Monde has learned from corroborating sources. These are sensitive discussions, most of which are classified, relaunched in light of potential American withdrawal of support for Kiev once Donald Trump takes office on January 20th, 2025. I do not believe that America is going to be withdrawing support from Ukraine. I believe the support they have available for Ukraine simply doesn't exist, and now they're trying to re-explore what options they have in either continuing this or freezing it. Discussions are underway between the UK and France on defense cooperation, particularly in a view of creating a hard core of allies, a coalition of the willing, if you will, in Europe, focused on Ukraine and wider European security, confided a British military source to Le Monde. And then we have this very recent article from Sky News. Zelensky suggests hot phase of Ukraine war could end in return for NATO membership if offered, even if seized land isn't returned immediately. So this is Ukraine slowly accepting the reality that it's not getting its territory back and exploring the possibility of some sort of conflict freeze. That is the way this all looks. Vladimir Zelensky has suggested a ceasefire deal could be struck if Ukrainian territory he controls could be taken under the NATO umbrella, allowing him to negotiate the return of the rest later in a diplomatic way. That's in quotation marks. And of course, no, not in a diplomatic way. After they have time to rearm, re-equip, reorganize, they will launch another armed campaign against Russia, just as US-backed terrorists are doing in Syria right now as I'm talking. Mr. Zelensky said NATO membership would have to be offered to unoccupied parts of the country in order to end the hot phase of the war, as long as the NATO invitation itself recognizes Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. He appeared to accept occupied eastern parts of the country would fall outside of such a deal for the time being, which means Russia has absolutely no reason to agree to this in any shape, form, or way, because all it's going to do is allow Ukraine to escape Russia's growing momentum right now, rearm, regroup, and become a greater threat to Russia than it already was before Russia decided it needed to launch a special military operation. And we can see this whole process, a glimpse of how this will work out in the near, I would say relatively near future. We can see how it's playing out in Syria. All of these agreements meant to freeze and eventually end the conflict were used by the collective West to simply rearm, reorganize, relaunch their proxy war against Syria and ultimately Iran and Russia. This Sky News article, even though Ukrainian leader Zelensky is talking about NATO membership, this could still happen even without NATO membership. The collective West would just send a coalition of forces into Ukraine to ensure at least part of what is left of Ukraine would be under Western occupation, just as parts of Syria are under Turkish and American occupation. And it would leave Russia a choice whether to stop where it is or to open up an actual conflict with Western forces in Ukraine, just as Russia and Syria would have to do vis-a-vis the US or Turkey in Syria. The US has essentially declared war on the status quo. It understands that within the global status quo, the world is gradually pivoting away from US-led hegemony to multipolarism. So they have declared war on the status quo, and they are attempting to destroy it in every manner possible, including war, proxy war, outright war. The rest of the world is going to have to make difficult decisions regarding US aggression around the globe. It's war on the status quo, and what the rest of the world is willing to do to stop this, to preserve the status quo, or to create a new status quo. As the US becomes more and more reckless, I believe more and more difficult decisions need to be made to confront and contain US actions. At the end of the day, we have to just wait and see. We do not know where the limits of where the true limits of American, Russian, Iranian, and Chinese power actually are. That information will avail itself as events unfold, but we need to keep a close eye on them and do careful analysis in the meantime. And I will continue to keep an eye on all of this. Until then, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. All of my videos go up on YouTube, Telegram, and Rumble. I'm also up on X. All of the links that I reference in this video are in the video description below, as are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. The links will be in the video description below. That is what allows me to continue doing this work. So if you've given me a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no resources at all and you just help share my work with others, that is all greatly appreciated. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.